From the campus of the University of Nebraska at Omaha. Consider This, a program of issues and information behind today's news.
As the moratorium on evictions comes to an end on July 31st, millions could be faced with the loss of their homes. Autumn Murrow is one of them.
Yes, it's been really hard every day. I don't know how I'm going to pay my rent. I've had multiple eviction notices. Every morning I wake up and I'm just not sure what I'm going to do.
Hi everyone, I'm Kathy Wyatt. Welcome to this week's edition of Consider This. Our topic, eviction bans to expire. Joining us to talk more about it are Scott Mertz, managing attorney at Legal Aid of Nebraska, and Ernie Goss. Dr. Goss is a professor of economics at Creighton University's Hyder College of Business. Thank you both so much for being here and welcome.
Good to be here.
Thank you for having us.
You bet. Scott, I want to start with you. What is supposed to happen on July 31st?
July 31st is going to be the last day of CDC's eviction moratorium. More specifically, this is a temporary halt on certain residential evictions. It's been in effect for 11 months, and that'll be its last day of enforcement.
Talk about the backstory on that. You said it's been in force for 11 months. How did it come about?
Well, this is the second federally implemented residential eviction ban. Way back at the start of the pandemic, under the CARES Act, if you remember back in late March of 2020, part of that law had a 120-day moratorium that applied federally. But that moratorium only applied to certain properties that were federally backed or in some ways federally financed. If you were on those types of properties, you would not be evicted during that 120-day period for non-payment of rent. When that moratorium expired in late summer of 2020, there was a concern that there would be a backlog of evictions and really a homelessness crisis across the country. Everyone was waiting as to how the government would respond and what they would do. And that's when the CDC put in effect, as of September 4 of 2020, this temporary halt to certain residential evictions as part of a broader effort to curb the spread of the coronavirus, because homelessness, overcrowding of people would result in the spread of the virus. So the CDC, as of that date, indicated that if you qualified for the protections of that moratorium, you should not be evicted for non-payment of rent if you are a renter.
Okay, so July 31st is supposed to be the day they lift that. I'm going to ask you the million-dollar question. Do you think it will be extended?
No. As of right now, we have no expectation of it being extended. Now, it has been extended 4 times during its lifespan of the 11 months. But the director of the CDC said that the last extension was the final extension. And in fact, the Supreme Court, when they issued a decision not to overturn or vacate the CDC order, did cite an expectation that the CDC order wouldn't be around past the end of July as part of that decision. So there's really no reason to believe that there's going to be any further extensions.
Okay, Dr. Goss, I want to ask you, as an economist, likely saw this coming, right? If we go back pre-COVID, right, in the affordable housing crisis, paint a picture of what was going on, especially in terms of renters at that time.
Well, renters have always been under pressure to make their monthly rent, and especially now with housing prices over the last few years have been escalating, now at 14%, but even pre-pandemic increases were over 10%. So housing had become less and less affordable. But I have to say, the CDC, I don't have a medical background. I don't make medical decisions. The CDC does not have an economic background. They should not have made this decision. It should have been recommended, and then the executive branch should have made the decision whether or not to have the moratorium on evictions. It just should never happen in the first place, in my judgment.
Okay, so it did, and we're looking at this now, and we're looking at all of these renters, many of whom are struggling. This was really the straw that broke the camel's back for so many folks. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, and I'm here, I think, more to talk, in my judgment, to talk about the problems that it seemed to be little thought given to the implementation of this. I mean, if you can't afford your rent in the first month, then how in the heck are you going to afford when you've got 6 or 7 months of rent to be paid? In other words, there's going to be, in my judgment, an avalanche of evictions on July the 31st. And who could not see that coming? I mean, you have to be an economist to see this coming, and yet we now see it. And communities, now it's just because the CDC's eviction moratorium is ending, there are communities across the U.S., Los Angeles, for example, still has eviction moratorium. So it's just, they're ending for the CDC, but there are other evictions across the nation which are not ending. And again, there's been no recognition of the pinch this puts on the landowner, the property owner. There are many men and women out there they saved up their retirement, they have a house, a home they're renting, and all of a sudden they're being told, what do you do? Where do you get your rent? Where do you get it? And so it's put a pressure on them, and the answer was, well, we'll have a moratorium on your mortgage payments. That is not sufficient and has not been sufficient for the homeowner. And everybody's not BlackRock. I mean, the assumption is BlackRock, of course, they're now going in and buying these properties across the nation. I mean, every one of us who owns any property, I get calls on my own property here in Dundee, hey, will you sell your house? And I'm like, no, I live in this house. I mean, it is absurd what has happened, and part of it is because of the very poor implementation of the CDC's eviction moratorium. It's like much of, and again, I will not comment on the medical missteps of the CDC, but this is an economic misstep on the CDC's part. And then Congress and the administration, both the Trump and the Biden administration, have not provided any solution when the eviction moratorium ends. I mean, this is we've seen it coming, and there is no, I've seen no real solution out there when it comes. And by the way, during this the pandemic, a lot of the folks out there, the savings rate went up to 28% from 2 and 3% because of all the money that was provided by the federal government. Yet how much of it went to rent support? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question. But the fact is that many homeowners, those landlords they're sometimes called, they were pinched as well, and there's been little effort to provide them relief. What about those the landlords?
Scott, I want to ask you, as Dr. Goss was talking, what are you thinking?
I am thinking that there is a recognition that there's a pinch put on landlords, and that there is a crisis that's created when you keep extending the moratorium. Yes. And you increase the backlog of evictions. But there is an answer, and at least there was a plan with respect to how to address that problem, and that is with money, with just massive sums of cash money reaching their way to the tenants and their landlords. This is through emergency rental assistance, or ERA. Mm-hmm. Between the appropriations bill at the end of 2020 and the American Rescue Plan, there's over $45 billion that was allocated simply to address this problem and ensure that renters who have fallen behind on rent and landlords who have not been getting rental payments do have access to cash money that's going to make them whole. Even though the pandemic obviously was not anyone's fault, people suffered as a result of the pandemic and fell behind when their income was interrupted.
Okay.
But that solution has been rejected by many landlords. In other words, the paperwork, the bureaucracy. I mean, this is just a calamity, nothing short of a calamity for the landlords and the tenants. I'm not for the U.S. economy, certainly not doing that much for the economy, but this was not anyone could. You don't have to be a soothsayer to see this one coming. I mean, it was a calamity at the beginning, in the middle, and now at the end. And many of the landlords are not signing up to get this $46 billion that was provided because of the bureaucracy involved and the restrictions. In other words, once you sign on to get part of your past unpaid rent, then you come under the rules and regulations that are part of that, part of this supposed solution.
And I want to talk about that, and I also want to talk about folks on both sides of the fence too, because I think it's a really great point that you're bringing up, Dr. Goss. Before we get any further, though, in talking about the challenges in terms of the process itself, For people who are watching, who have not been through an eviction, right? They're hearing the word quite a bit nowadays, but they themselves have not gone through that process, either as a renter or as a landlord. So Scott, talk to us about what's involved in the eviction process.
Certainly. Here in Nebraska, all evictions start with a notice. If you're a tenant and your landlord is seeking to remove you from the property, the landlord has to give you something in writing informing you as to why and when you need to leave. If the tenant has not left, that is when things go to court, in which case a landlord could file a lawsuit. A summons would get its way to the tenant, and the tenant is informed of when they have to appear in court. Here in Nebraska, that's as soon as 10 to 14 days from the time that those papers are filed in court. And so at a hearing in a courthouse, a judge is going to make a determination as to whether or not that landlord is entitled to have their property back and the tenants removed from that property. That's all decided, again, within 10 to 14 days from the time of filing. It is not a lot of time between asking for an eviction and a final determination made.
Okay, bring in the moratoria then. And how did that process, if it did, change the eviction process?
So the question would be, does the moratorium apply? A lot of people hear the word moratorium. That's probably not even that correct of a term as to with respect to what the CDC had done. You have to qualify for the moratorium, and it has to apply to the actual eviction action in order for the CDC's order to do anything to stop an eviction. So primarily, it's going to be effective if you're sued for non-payment of rent, and if you as a tenant can sign a document indicating that you have fallen behind on your rent for reasons beyond your control, for loss of income or extreme medical expenses, you would in turn sign that document and provide it to your landlord, indicating that you qualify for the CDC's moratorium. If you have done that, the landlord is not supposed to proceed with the eviction at that point in time. But even if the landlord does, at that point the courts would make a determination that if the CDC applied to the case before the bench, that the eviction would not proceed during the lifespan of the CDC's order. Now that may take the form of just a dismissal of the case outright, so that there is no eviction case on file anymore. A lot of other jurisdictions would just continue the matter out so that the hearing would then continue on after the end of the CDC's order.
Okay, let's just briefly, let's put up the application. I want to talk to folks. How did they apply for this? What happened in order for them to be approved?
Well, in order to get the benefit of the CDC's order, you would have to access the document here, and you would have to check off the boxes as they apply to you in your situation, and attest that you economically qualify, that if you were evicted, you were at risk of homelessness, or you would have to overcrowd with individuals, the very thing the CDC was seeking to avoid with this order. And perhaps most importantly to this document, that you would try your best to apply for the rental assistance. That just because you're getting the benefit of this order, you would still have an obligation to continue to try and pay what you could and seek assistance if you could not afford it. That you would be, again, attesting under penalty of perjury. I may not afford my rent money now. I'm going to do my best. I'm going to try to get rental assistance as it became available, because there was obviously a slow rollout to the rental assistance money that was approved back in 2020 and 2021.
Let me ask you this, Dr. Goss brought it up earlier in terms of the CDC's involvement in this capacity. Do you have thoughts on that?
Well, it certainly is new. I mean, we had never seen anything like this from the Center for Disease Control before, but there has been litigation that has played out in federal courts all across the country during the 11 months that the CDC has been in effect. Now, some federal courts have ruled that the CDC did have the authority to issue this order under their broad powers under the Public Health Act. The CDC does have an interest in protecting the spread of communicable disease, like the coronavirus. And in seeking to curb the spread of the disease, they had an interest in slowing the spread of homelessness and displacement from people's housing.
But one thing you haven't talked about is the lease. In other words, if the lease has expired, can you then evict the person and the family? And that's a key point. In other words, if you're not, you're talking about abrogation of property rights. In other words, this landlord's property. He or she is paid for this property, they own the property, and the lease is expired. Do they then have the right to evict them? Because then you're talking about essentially abrogation of property rights.
Well, again, the CDC does not apply to all evictions, and it has not applied to all evictions. People have been evicted.
What about that case, though?
Well, again, in that case, there are instances where people have been evicted because their leases have expired, and the landlords have opted to not renew and have followed the proper procedures in notifying tenants that they are not going to continue with the leases. There are some courts that have ruled that the CDC does still apply in that situation, and there are many courts that have interpreted the CDC order to still apply in that situation. Yeah. We have all across the state and the country judges interpreting the CDC's order differently, but the vast majority of individuals here in Nebraska have been evicted under the scenario described by Dr. Goss, that individuals who do not have the lease continue on past the expiration, they can and have been evicted during the 11 months of the CDC's order.
I want to go specifically to these funds now, Scott. I want to ask you so that we get some perspective on this whole thing. What was available in terms of the funding piece?
Well, what was and is still available. People can access the money that has been allocated to the states in order to curb this very concern of a eviction crisis. Here in Nebraska, over $150 million of those $40+ billion have been allocated just for our tenants. Now, that's distributed by different organizations. Someone is doing it here in Omaha. There's for the balance of Douglas County, another organization is taking care of that portion. And then in Lincoln and Lancaster County, somebody else is in charge of distributing those funds. And across the balance of state, for the remainder of Nebraska, someone else is tasked with distributing those funds. So individuals can apply for that money and have been able to apply for that money for the last several months. It's all a matter of being sure that you qualify, to indicate that you are a renter, that you are behind on rent, that you've suffered some manner of financial hardship, and that you can document that. And if you can follow these steps, you should qualify for rental assistance. Again, tremendous amounts of rental assistance that is currently right now not being used and is at risk of basically going back to the federal government if it does not get used by our low-income renters here in Nebraska.
Well, and that's been a big topic of conversation for people. We have this huge chunk of change that's been allocated, but very little of it has made its way into the homes of the people who need it. Why? What were the biggest challenges that folks were facing in getting those dollars distributed?
I think a number of things. I mean, just basic administration. I mean, this is a huge undertaking with respect to allocating so many funds all across the state. Again, the scope of this distribution of money is far beyond what we've seen at a local level. We did distribute rent money under the CARES Act back in 2020, but the sums of money are so much greater now than what we were distributing back in 2020. Two, I think a lot is just lack of awareness, both as to that this program and money exist at all, and that individuals don't know that they qualify for it. And if they are somewhat aware of the programs, not aware of what they need to do in order to access that money. We are really focused at Legal Aid in Nebraska on making sure everyone knows where they need to go in order to get that money and apply for it as soon as possible. It is taking a long time for that money to reach people, to reach the tenant, to reach the landlords, but there was no reason not to apply. We are finding little in the way of resistance for actual applications getting through without too much difficulty.
Are we finding that there are renters out there who may be reluctant just because of good old-fashioned pride? Could that be a possibility, that maybe they're embarrassed to ask for assistance, or would you say no?
Perhaps. I mean, there are all sorts of reasons that people, again, who perhaps have never applied for assistance before would not, but people should not let that be a barrier. These are public funds. Again, the reason behind this money being made available to people, and again, readily, easily. I mean, as long as they're filling out the applications online, submitting documentation. But the reason it's there is because there's an expectation that this is no one's fault, that the pandemic in particular is not the fault of individuals or their actions. People were tasked with, again, containing the spread of the virus by sheltering in place, having to reduce their work hours, having to take care of children or the sick or the infirm. And because of that, again, maybe they're working now, but they fell behind months ago and are still suffering the ramifications of having to get caught up. the ripple effects of this pandemic are great, and we're going to be living with those ramifications for a long time. People should not concern themselves with any pride or concerns about their particular situation. If they fell behind because of reasons beyond their control and they are renters, they're eligible for this money, and they should try and apply while the money is still available.
As Scott's talking, Dr. Goss, I'm thinking I really like the idea that people are getting the assistance they may need, but what is a little bit troubling is this idea that it's such a large sum of money, and I'm hearing that maybe there isn't the awareness that's needed. There's not. It's concerning to hear about such a large sum, and we're having trouble getting it to the people who need it. What are your thoughts on that?
They call me unsurprised. I mean, if the federal government would have problems. I mean, who would have thought this? I mean, this has been a fiasco, and it continues to be at the bureaucratic snafus that have taken place. And as I said, it should have never been pushed by the CDC. It should have been pushed by the executive branch and with the agreement of Congress. But nonetheless, the amount of money that we're talking about is significant. You're talking about $46 billion. That's with a B, and you're talking about this combined with the other funds that went into the payments. We're talking about $300 a week, for example. We talk about those who lost their job. Well, if you lost your job through and you qualify for unemployment insurance, then you get a $300 add-on per week of that. So a high proportion of individuals are in fact not coming back to work because the incentive is not to come back to work until September 1, when that particular program ends at the federal level. Now, it's ended in Nebraska already. The Governor Ricketts ended that already. But nonetheless, what I'm concerned about is the bureaucratic. I'm not talking about it at the Legal Aid Society. I'm talking about at Congress, at the CDC, and at the administration. But also, we've abrogated people's constitutional rights, and Scott would know far more than I as a lawyer. But the abrogation of property rights. These again, who owns the property? It's almost like the public now owns rental properties in America. Now, that's a scary proposition. In other words, as the former mayor of Chicago said, don't let a good catastrophe go to waste, and I'd just say that we have not. The intervention of the federal government into the housing situation in America, and you've seen what it's done. Right now we're talking about housing prices growing 14% year over year. I cannot answer my cell phone without somebody trying to buy my house. Mm-hmm. And they're going to rent the house out. And you're talking about individuals that, again, at the end, there's going to be, in my judgment, an avalanche of individuals and families out there who are ousted because a lot of the landlords are not going to go through the bureaucracy. There are a lot of regulations that come along. You get the $46 billion. It's not without pain.
I'd like to just a few points that were in that answer.
Sure.
I mean, one, again, the CDC order is the CDC order, and it is coming to an end. It's going to be behind us after July 31st. But I would point out that Congress did extend the CDC order. It did originate with the CDC, but in the Appropriations Bill of 2020, it was Congress in its own bill that extended it for the first extension at the end of the year. Two, with respect to the federal government and the federal government's involvement in what we're talking about right now, an eviction crisis, the federal government's interest is in avoiding an eviction crisis all across the country. And the Treasury Department has been putting out guidance to all the local distributors of this money to do whatever they can to loosen restrictions and get the money out more quickly and easier. That's been the messaging from the federal government to those local distributors, including those here in Nebraska. And with respect to accessing that money, again, we are dealing primarily with tenants at Legal Aid in Nebraska and trying to direct them to the money. But it is available to the landlords and the property owners to apply for and access. Again, that's a big distinction between the distribution of funds right now in 2021 than how it was in 2020. If you're a landlord, you've got renters who have been getting the benefit of this moratorium and you've been saddled with them without getting money for months, you can put in an application and access that money. And as far as submitting yourself to regulation or anything burdensome. The main component that you, as a property owner, would have to attest to is that you're just not going to evict for the period of time with which you're getting the benefit of the rent money. That if you're going to get this rent money for a number of months, including prospective months, not just past months, you can get up to 3 months going forward under the program. All that the distributors ask is that you acknowledge that you're not going to evict during that period of time. If you're going to avail yourself of getting this money, okay, then the government in exchange knows that those individuals are going to stay housed during that period of time.
Okay, so as we're moving forward here, because we just have 2 minutes left, July 31st rolls around. I mean, with everything that's been said, sometimes I think of this as too little too late. With everything that's been said, what can we expect on July 31st then?
The concern is increase in the number of eviction filings all across the state. And a lot of those hearings that have just been continued out for after July 31 will go forward with evictions. The hope is that people are directed to rental assistance and directed to legal assistance. We want to make sure people are trying to get money if they owe money and that everybody gets made whole. But a lot of evictions don't really have to do with money, and you may be entitled to a legal defense that you're not even aware of as a tenant. So always talk to an attorney if you get a notice from your landlord that's threatening you with anything to make sure that legally your landlord can do what they're threatening.
Final thought, which goes to homelessness then here. If people are out on the streets, and they're likely going to be some of those people who've not faced homelessness before. Thoughts on that, Scott?
It's scary. Again, the system is going to be overwhelmed. It was overwhelmed before the pandemic. And if we have an increase beyond what we were seeing in terms of eviction numbers before the pandemic, all happened in a really concentrated period of time in August or September, that's going to be tough for our system, our homeless prevention system to really bear. Okay. So that's why it's important.
And it'll be an avalanche of, not just in Nebraska, you said Nebraska, but across the nation. It's a lawyer's dream. I mean, we're going to see so much legal action. And that's not where economists want to see us. I mean, that's not where we need to be.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for being here today and for sharing your time and expertise. Best wishes to everybody moving forward on this topic. And thank you all for watching.
Thanks.
We'll see you next week.
Consider This is an issues and information program produced by UNO Television. More information and program archives can be found at nebraskapublicmedia.org/considerthis. If you'd like to share your comments about this program, call UNO Television at 402-554-2516 during regular business hours, or send an email to cwyatt@unomaha.edu.